We studied earlier the very groundbreaking idea of the Tanya. What is holiness? What is Kedusha? And the Alter Rebbe taught us that Kedusha, holiness, is any person or thing or behavior which is completely directed towards God, godliness, God's desire, God's will for us in this world. That's called holiness. Anything that's surrendered and submissive towards the forces of the Creator of God in a revealed way, which tells us anything that's not completely surrendered and submissive towards the will of God, it's not directed towards an act of godliness, is not holy. It's unholy, meaning it comes from Sitra Achra, the other side. The metaphor that the Alter Rebbe tells us today is there's the panim and there's the achor. Everything in life has the front side and its back side, its rear end. There's two sides to every coin. Every phenomenon has its front projection and it's behind. So God also has these two sides to himself. There's the panim, there's his face, and then there's the behind, there's the rear end. What does that mean? That's a metaphor. The difference of your face and your behind is as follows. How much of you and how much of your attention and how much of your inner self, have we paused here, is directed towards he or she who you're dealing with? Make sure we're connected here. In other words, imagine you're sitting down with a loved one, with a friend or somebody, and you're having a conversation with them, and they're talking to you. How much of you is there? How much of you are you giving to them? So when you are present and you're fully focused and your eyes are on them and you're listening and you're absorbing and you're responding, all of you is there. That's an experience, an encounter where pnimiyut, your inner self, is with them. If you're on your phone, you're texting, you're listening to something, you're reading a book, and you're half-heartedly responding, listening to them, you're giving off only a very superficial external part of yourself. But where are you? You're not in that encounter, you're somewhere else. Similarly with God, there are times or situations where God is fully present in giving over his inner self to that which is creating. And that's called Kedusha, that is holiness, where all of God's presence is there. The klipa, the other side, will be the achoraim, the rear end of God, where God is not giving his full attention, his full presence, but rather like he gives something from behind. The metaphor would be if you give something to a friend, a gift, you give it to them with four eyes. But if you have to give something to an enemy, somebody you don't like, you throw it over your shoulder, you don't want to look at them in the face. Similarly, there are things that are undesirable by God, right? The whole klipat, all of the choices of evil in this world, it's not like God really wants them to exist. They're counter to God's purpose, but he creates them in order. There should be a kind of choice and challenge in this world, but he creates it in a way that they're receiving only a very external, superficial part of God's energy. Meaning everything, every creation is created by God. And in our world, every single entity has a force of godliness within it, which animates it and creates it and makes it exist. However, those people or things or actions which are not directed towards God, they are distracted, they're directed towards something other than God, meaning directed towards selfishness, and all those kinds of things, receive their life force from God in a very external, superficial way, meaning that the energy of godliness goes through a whole process and a series of descent, level after level, lower and lower, more and more diminished, a whole process of tzimtzumim, of contractions, where God's light gets smaller and more diminished until it arrives in a place where it's still the life force of God animating and giving it energy. However, it is such a small trace of the origin of that life force, so little is left of it. And also, the Alter Rebbe says, it's in a state of galut, in a state of exile. God is in exile. What's the metaphor for being in exile? When you're in exile, you're taken captive. You are not free to be you and to do as you wish, but rather you're controlled by the captors. They call the shots, not you. Similarly, that level of godliness, which has become so diminished and become trapped in the exile, it's so concealed over there in the klippa and the pill and the shell, which are those things or people which are hiding God's essence and are directed towards other pursuits. So there God is in exile. And that's why there's a teaching from the Arizal, the great Kabbalist. Our world, he says, this physical world is a world full of klippa, full of evil, full of concealment of God, and the wicked dominate and the wicked prosper in this world, which is something that we see sometimes, and we ask ourselves that question. But the answer is because our world is generally a product of the God energy that is descended so low and become trapped and captive to the shell, to that which conceals it. Of course, there's many parts of holiness to this world as well, which we're going to soon discover. So that's a choice that we make at all times in terms of how we behave, our thoughts, our words, and our behaviors. Do we want them to be receiving an encounter with God from God's essence, which means we give our full attention towards God and God reciprocates? Or are we completely distracted and we're pursuing things other than the truth and godly matters? Well, then we're receiving God's life force in a very external, superficial way as well, in a state of exile. To conclude this chapter, the Alter Rebbe tells us that when we talk about klippa, the evil side, the other side, the dark side, we talk about two different categories. We've mentioned these briefly earlier, but now we're going to explain them at greater length. The lowest level of klippa, the lowest level of the other dark side of impurity and unholiness, is called shalosh klipot tmeot, the three impure klipot. What are they? So they originate, this is a Kabbalistic teaching, but it originates in scripture with the prophecy of Yecheskel. Ezekiel, the prophet, had a prophecy where he saw three forces that were going to come and destroy the Jewish people. A fierce wind, a dark great cloud, and a flaming fire. And so the Kabbalah takes these three metaphors and says, those are the three impure states of existence, where God and godliness is completely hidden and concealed within them. And they are what becomes irredeemable levels of impurity. Meaning those are things that are completely contrary, the opposite to God's will, to God's purpose. Those are things that stand in complete denial to God's existence and God's intention for our world. That would be the source for all impure, forbidden things in this world. So, for example, humans, people who live their life in a state of heresy, in denial of God, they're receiving their life force from these three impure klipot. Animals, which are not kosher, the Torah forbids them. That means we can't access them, we cannot eat them. They too are receiving their life force from these three impure klipot. All vegetation and growth that is forbidden, what would that be? For example, the first 3 years of a tree, so it's arla, or certain other things that we cannot eat from yet because we haven't given out tithes and various gifts in the way the Torah wants us to manage the agricultural cycles. They too, when they're forbidden, receive their life force from the three impure klipot. And similarly, within a person, if we engage in behaviors, our thoughts, our words, our actions are doing things, are involved in things that are garbing the unholy soul, meaning they're not directed towards a godly purpose, they're also receiving their life force from the three impure klipot. Therefore, and we're going to remain with a couple questions, which we're going to continue tomorrow. So therefore, we have to be very vigilant about how we conduct ourselves in this world and what we open ourselves up to. Because if we're doing or being things that are not holy, not directed towards God, we lower ourselves to those levels of being a recipient of the life force from the three impure klipot, where there's a complete concealment of truth and of godliness in a way that God is in exile. Anytime we behave in a way that we're not cognizant of our Creator and of our purpose in this world, we are essentially putting God into exile. So the remaining two questions, which we're going to resolve in the next class, is as follows. Number one, we have said that these phenomena that are receiving their life force from these impure klipot are in an irredeemable state of concealment. they're never going to have a connection with holiness. They're always going to be recipients from the other dark side. Is that true? Is it always impossible? Is there no hope for these things to ever have some kind of redemption and be brought over to the side of holiness? That's question number one. And question number two is, we've said that all the people or things that are completely unholy, making very evil choices in this world, doing things that are contrary to the Torah, contrary to the truth, they're recipients of the three impure klipot. But what about things that they're not holy, they're not directed towards God, they're not completely unholy because they're not living in a state of denial against God's existence, but they're just casual, they're just, without any great intention, not towards holiness and not towards evil, which is many of the thoughts and the behaviors that we have throughout a day. What would characterize their nature? They're not completely holy, but they're not completely evil. What kind of life force are they being a recipient of from godliness? Those are remaining questions, which we're going to continue in the next class. I wish you a beautiful day, and God bless you.